that cell, as you can maybe tell by the name, were given a lot of sunlight. Were given a lot of fresh air. And they were pretty much allowed to go inside that tuberculosis yard outside whenever they wanted. Because before, germ theory and how bacteria worked, was kind of a mainstream idea in the medical community, the way that they thought that they could treat prisoners and people who had tuberculosis, lung infections, were to give them a lot of air and a lot of light and a lot of exercise. So calisthenics and jumping jacks and whatnot. This is the time before antibiotics, a time before modern medicine that we kind of take for granted today. So they were working with the best that they had to try to treat this highly infectious disease. But ultimately, those treatments do more harm than good. But they were working with the best information that they had. And in that cell there, another cool thing I want to point out is an early adjustable bed. Pretty different than a sleep number today, but still that same idea. So it's so dark where we're standing right now, because we're standing under that second story expansion that was added. And it's that second story expansion that made opening up cell block 3 pretty difficult. As I mentioned, we just opened this up for the first time like over a month ago for visitors for the first time since 1971, which is pretty cool. So that, this was never designed to have a second story on top of it. So that was really destroying the structural integrity of the roof. So after a lot of fundraising efforts and, enough time, we were able to open it up to the public. So most visitors here at Eastern State start their tour by going up cell block 1 and learning about prisons before Eastern State. And learning about the early years here at Eastern State. So does this fixture in the wall look familiar to anyone, or do you guys have any guesses about what it could be? You saw a recreated one in cell block 1. The feeding hole, exactly. The feeding holes that are here inside cell block 3 are the only ones that are original to 1829. Eastern State was never supposed to have doors in its hallway. It was supposed to just have feeding holes. So the only way in or out of the cell was from the exercise yard outside going in. That's horribly inconvenient for anyone needing to visit the prisoners. And let's just say if someone was hurting themselves inside a cell, there's no way for a guard to get in there and diffuse or neutralize the situation. So cell blocks 4, 5, 6, and 7 were all designed to have doors in the hallways. Eventually, it took them about 2 decades to remove all of the feeding holes from cell blocks 1, 2, and 3. But pretty early in cell block 3's history, they took down the walls, dividing some cells, so you don't need 2 doors for 1 room. So they removed 1 feeding hole, and they kept the other. Through this cell here, you can see steps. Those were steps that led up to the second story expansion. So here we're standing between 2 examples of medical care here at Eastern State. We have Eastern State's X-ray room over on the right, and Eastern State's hydrotherapy room over on the left. Eastern State received its first X-ray machine in 1917, so pretty early on in the X-ray machine's history. And just like in hospitals and prisons today, X-ray machines are an invaluable tool for helping, treat patients. By the 1960s, every prisoner, staff member, doctor, were required to receive periodic chest X-rays to check for signs of tuberculosis. Over here is the hydrotherapy room, and you can see some bars, in that room, and around those bars would have been a tub of water. If a prisoner was too weak to stand on their own in the exercise yard, or too weak to exercise, they would participate in, aquaphysical therapy inside that space. Exercising their legs and whatnot. So going back to that idea of exercise, if you guys wouldn't mind waiting for me just to go ahead. So in that space, reminds us of the idea of exercise, sunlight, and fresh air of curing a prisoner. This room was extremely helpful and invaluable in keeping people, alive and safe. This room, not so much helpful. So kind of the duality and the dichotomy of two different types of medical practices at Eastern State. Over here on the right was the dietary kitchen. And the stove that we can see in there today is the same stove from this photo in 1958, which is pretty cool that it's still sitting there today. And this was the dietary kitchen of Eastern State. We talked about the nickname consumption earlier. So prisoners were prescribed high-protein diets to sort of keep their weight up and keep their energy up. By the 1950s, tuberculosis was pretty much wiped away from Eastern State because of antibiotics. So this kitchen served to be more of a special dietary kitchen, serving the needs of diabetic prisoners and prisoners who had other eating-related disorders and needed other special dietary considerations. Over here on the left, we have a sign with a guard holding the door to a feeding hole. And over on the right, we have a door that says psychiatric department. And in this room, there would have been group therapy sessions led by prison guards sometimes. Some guards were actually trained to lead group therapy sessions. By the 1950s and 60s, Eastern State became known as kind of the preeminent, the best psychiatric facility in the Pennsylvania state prison system. You remember those big doors at the end with the glass windows in those doors? Well, they converted some solarium cells into psychiatric observation cells in the 1950s and 60s. So prisons from all over the state of Pennsylvania would send prisoners here to Eastern State to be evaluated and observed and identified to see what was going on with them. But that's a pretty far cry from how Eastern State dealt with mental illness in the 19th century. We're returning to that idea of prisons are just a smaller version of society on the outside. And society didn't have a good understanding of mental illness in the 19th century. So Eastern State didn't have a good understanding of mental illness. I'm sure conditions like autism and dyslexia existed long before we gave names to them. And a prisoner who had a mental disorder here at the prison, they might have thought that they were, a guard might assume that they're being disobedient, that they're not listening on purpose, and they would receive beatings, floggings, being put inside tranquilizing chairs, and being put inside all dark cells, because they felt that they were being disobedient. So it sounds exceptionally cruel, but that's how the world was. That's how society was at the time. It's not just because Eastern State was exceptionally cruel. Do you guys have any questions before we enter the operating room?
Where's the mad chair?
The mad chair? There is no mad chair here. Benjamin Rush was one of the founders of Eastern State, really America's first psychologist and one of the first main psychologists in the world. He had what people now call a mad chair, because he did different experiments thinking that he would help people, but there's no mad chair here. Cool. So we can head on into the operating room now. The operating room is right here on the left. Head on in. I'll join you in just a second. Head on in there. You can walk right in. So the room that we are walking into right now opened in 1910. And here's a photo. I'm going to be standing right here with these. This photo here is from 1912. Pretty hygienic in this photo here, especially compared to this room's current state today. Up above us would have been skylights, you can see here in the photo. And they later replaced those skylights with air conditioning units. Back there was the washroom, and we can see early anesthesia equipment was stored back there. The lamp that's present today is not the same lamp from 1912, but by 1941 we see that the lamp is present in this photo. And in this photo there are prisoners assisting with blood donations during World War II. During the 20th century, there are anywhere from 15 to 30 prisoners employed inside cell block 3, working basically, the full-time job. They would be nurses, orderlies, doctor's assistants, or sometimes even surgery assistants, assisting with procedures in this room. Which is pretty interesting. This room could handle pretty much any surgery, of the day. There are heart surgeries that were performed in this room, foot surgeries, eye surgeries, skin surgeries, bone surgeries. They could take out someone's appendix or their tonsils. In fact, Al Capone actually had his tonsils removed in this space, along with 5 other prisoners at the same time. Probably going snip, snap, snip, snap, snip, snap, right down the row, all 5 of them. Al Capone also had a second minor procedure performed in this room, but we don't know what it was. They didn't write down what the procedure was. It was minor. We know who did it and when it happened. I should say, we have a guess of who did it. But we don't know exactly what it was, so one of the many mysteries here at Eastern State. By the 1950s and 60s, there were as many as 300 procedures performed in this room annually over that 20-year period. So that's a lot of procedures. And this is by far one of the most important rooms in the hospital, and in the prison as a whole. Over the 20th century, Eastern State's permanent medical staff of doctors, nurses, and psychiatrists grew larger and larger over the decades. And it was pretty fortunate where this prison is located, right in the heart of Philadelphia, because Philadelphia had the country's first medical school and hospital. So Philadelphia has always had a rich medical community. And so that was a great resource that, medical director had of assigning doctors from the outside to come in and assist with special procedures. So they wouldn't have to have a risk of bringing prisoners, from this prison to a general hospital. Do you guys have any questions before we head on out? Awesome. So, I have one last thing that I want to share with you guys. So this is one of my favorite spaces in the prison because we really can't get any other sense of the building's entire history anywhere else in the museum. So from this one point, we can kind of survey all of the prison's, architectural, physical history. Out there, we have the original stonework from, 1829, John Haviland, the architect, the original 7 cell blocks. We have the plaster and the brick that was added when Eastern State was converted from an exercise yard. We have electricity, which came to Eastern State in 1889. And we have this kind of green tiling from the 1940s or 50s. And then there's a tree growing through the wall, symbolizing Eastern State's abandonment period from 1971 to roughly 1991. So there's really nowhere else in the prison where we can stand and kind of, see its entire history, which is pretty cool. Right up there, right above the doorway. Cool. You guys have any questions? We can head on out now. All right, guys, head on out. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.